All right, guys, it's 9:01 and we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. Thanks for joining. I see people are getting on. Few people will straggle in, but since this is a recorded session, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome. I'll just do a quick intro. My name is Anne-Marie Fernandez, and I am the Senior Technical Product Solutions Marketing Manager here at ServiceNow, and we've got Drew with us today.
Hey guys, Drew Whittington. I'm a solution consultant in the IRM business unit, so I represent our risk products for ServiceNow.
Awesome. So we've got a full schedule, action-packed with a ton of great information by Drew, but we've got a couple quick housekeeping things. So at the end, hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A, but we do have a office hour scheduled next week, which is about 30 minutes, not recorded, for you all to come in and just ask some questions live. When you have questions during the session, please use the Q&A. That way we can capture the question. If we don't get to it, we can send out the answers after. And yes, this session will be recorded and sent out. I usually just put the link in the chat if you want to grab that. And also you'll get an email with the link to the recorded session and also a survey. So please fill out that survey so we can get some good feedback and know how to improve for next time. Oh, oops, that was the next slide. Sorry, Drew. I'm still waking up. Good morning, everybody. All right, so that was the Q&A. You can see the Q&A button there. If you want to put questions in there, we can grab those and answer them either through the Q&A or we'll save them for office hours next week if we run out of time. All right, next slide. All right, so today's agenda, today we're going to be talking about diving into entities and entity hierarchies. Why is one required, and some of the basics of what does it help with. But we really wanted today to be more of an advanced session. We're kind of assuming that folks are familiar with entities and work with them. If you didn't, that's okay. We're hoping you'll still get a lot out of today. But we want to really talk about governance, things like when should it be used and when it shouldn't, how you can set it up initially and plan. And also a key thing that's near and dear to Drew's heart, it's talked about a lot while we put this session together, is how do we maintain entity and entity structures over time? So before we get started, we've got a poll question just to get us to better understand the audience here today. If you could just quickly tell us about your current IRM implementation today. So do you see the questions? All right, yep. We'll give you a couple of seconds. Awesome. All right. I think everybody's answered, and I'll close the poll. All right.
Yeah, it's interesting. It looks, looking at the results over here, it looks like it's kind of split. You know, there's about as many people with a limited deployment as there are with a full deployment and expected usage. I see some folks evaluating us. Welcome. Glad you guys are here. I hope this is useful for you as you're planning out your evaluations and then as you buy and implement. My licensed and undeployed folks, I want y'all to pay attention very closely because this entity stuff will get you. Like this entities are the best thing about the solution. I think it's one of our differentiators. You do have to pay attention to them. You do have to get them right. It's one of these things that you need to think about well in advance of kind of implementing and starting your journey. So for that audience in particular, I think you're going to get the most out of this.
Awesome. Thanks for joining that poll, guys, and let's get started.
All right, cool. So let's kick this thing off. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of cover what is an entity hierarchy. So a lot of you folks, if you've already implemented, you have exposure to it. You may have a notion of what it is and what it's for, but basically it's a hierarchy of entities. So it is a relational framework between nodes that you can configure for your IRM program to serve a multitude of purposes, and that's what we're going to cover here. So the first thing you're setting up a framework that's unique to the risk and compliance teams. So typically your risk and compliance groups have a different view of the organization than a simple org chart or a geographical map lends it to. So it tends to be of those things, but not necessarily limited to those things. Then, let's see. It provides an abstraction layer. So to my original point about risk and compliance kind of have a different view of the world, what the entity hierarchy does for IRM and for those risk and compliance teams is it provides an abstraction layer that allows them to point at existing data without necessarily constraining that data unnaturally. So they kind of leave it in place. It gets to be managed by its own life cycle, but IRM gets to use it and benefit from that work where it's appropriate. And it can be anything. And you've probably heard this for my deployed folks. You've probably heard that an entity can be anything. So it can represent anything, an asset, a process, a person, a location, a department, kind of whatever your risk and compliance folks need to manage, it can represent those things. So it's similar in function to a CMDB. So for those of you who are familiar with our ITSM side, kind of CMDB was our bread and butter for a long time. That CMDB was a conceptual framework of either virtual or physical nodes and then the relationships between them. And so it's, the entity hierarchy serves a similar purpose, but it's much more broad than the CMDB. The CMDB tends to serve as that framework for IT service management and for them to operate. So it can refer to the CMDB, but it's not limited to the CMDB. It tends to consider the entire business. Now, something else IRM does with this entity hierarchy is it'll combine the entity hierarchy with other hierarchies inside of IRM. And this is where some of the magic starts to happen, where once you add that entity hierarchy to something like your risk hierarchy, so you might have a hierarchy of risks that have been defined by your risk folks, and that, you can do things like roll up and all that kind of stuff. But when you combine these two, then you get kind of the benefit of both, and the output is a highly orchestrated risk and compliance program. Okay, managed at kind of a data layer, and then those two data layers are kind of combined to get to your risks and controls that you're going to need. Now, why do we need these at all? So I see the hierarchies, what's the whole point? Well, this is where the entity hierarchy fits inside of the IRM structure. So the risks and controls are the base element that risk and compliance teams operate by. Okay, they drive all kinds of things. They're related to one another. They drive risk assessments. They drive control attestations. They drive indicators. They drive test plans. So risks and controls are that base unit of work that we're managing to, but we need to understand what they apply to. So those risks and controls don't exist in the ether. We need to understand what they're for, and that's what entities do for us. So let's take the example of SOX impacted processes as a scope. So what we need to do is identify our SOX impacted processes and then lay risks and controls on top of those so that we can manage. First thing we do is we tell ServiceNow what a SOX impacted process looks like. And then ServiceNow runs out and identifies every one of those processes for us by that definition. Once it identifies those processes, what it can do is it can assign risks and it can assign controls to that process on our behalf. So this is not something that's manually happening. The system's doing it for us. So because we told the system that this process is SOX impacted, ServiceNow creates that payload of risks and controls that are appropriate. Now, that mapping, the way we do that magic, it comes from our other two frameworks. Remember, I told you we combine hierarchies. So one of those is the risk framework, where you may have a SOX risk framework, and underneath that, all of your SOX risks. You attach the framework to that scope, and that's where all these risks come from. That's where these risks get instantiated. Then we do the same thing on the policy side. You're going to have policies internal to your business that represent what you need to do to be compliant with SOX. From there, you make that relationship to your scope, and it creates the controls for you. Then what we do with these entities is we bring that into an audit engagement. So when it comes time to audit my SOX processes, what I'm doing is I'm creating those processes. Actually, I'm not even creating, I'm just moving those processes into an audit engagement to scope that engagement. So I'm doing my SOX audit. Let me get these processes involved in that audit. And then continuing on, I bring over the good work I've done all year. So think about test plans, think about indicators, and then think about doing the rest of the field work based on the fact that I brought over my processes and I brought over everything that I've been doing all year. So this is the way that we scope our programs onto the business, is by using these entities. Think about for a second the risk and effort of doing all that manually. So if you think about what ServiceNow just did for you, even in the initial application of the risk and control payloads, think about the automation, right? The next time that's another SOX process comes online, ServiceNow is going to recognize that, stand up those risks and controls, do all the notifications for you. It's a vastly different starting point for your risk and compliance folks than doing something manually. Now, entities should be created when these are your desired outcomes. All right. So kind of when do we use them and when do we not use them? For the entity, if you want it to be the subject of a control, so I need to apply a control to this thing, or I need to assess the risk of this thing, excuse me, or I need to audit this thing, or I need to aggregate risk to this point. So that one's a little less straightforward than the previous three. So we have a function called risk rollup inside of ServiceNow. And one of the ways you can roll up risks is in that entity hierarchy. So you could conceive of an entity that exists where maybe you didn't assess it for risk, or maybe you didn't create a control for it, but you need to aggregate risk there because it supports a decision, right? So there's some executive that needs to make a decision about what they're going to do next, and aggregating risk at that level is meaningful. So how do we stand these up initially? Actually, I skipped a couple steps here. So first question. Do we have to always use existing records for entities? Remember, I told you that an entity can refer to an existing record, but it doesn't necessarily have to. You can start with a standalone entity, and we'll kind of get into how we do that later. Do I have to use the automated scoping? So recall how I showed you that we can automatically create risks and controls and scope processes in. The answer to this is no. You do not have to. You don't have to do that. You can instead create a manual one and then relate that manual entity to your risks and controls manually and bypass that entire automation. And then what I want to do is talk to you about how do we stand up this entity hierarchy initially. All right. So we've talked about where the entity hierarchy sits. We've talked about a little bit about what it does in terms of where it fits in the architecture and what we do with it. So the first step in managing your entity hierarchy is going to be establishing an oversight committee. So this is where I'm kind of speaking to if you've either implemented and you haven't done this, or if you've implemented, if you haven't implemented, this is an important first step. What you need to do here is establish who all is going to have a say in what entities we create. Okay, now these are some. I'm not going to read the slide. These are some usual suspects in that. So that's the first thing: is understand who's going to participate in the committee, and that's going to be your oversight group, right? Then this oversight group is going to have a scope of work. It's going to have a scope of, these are the things that it needs to do. So this oversight committee is going to have to define the outcomes. This oversight committee is going to have to define the process for managing these entities. Who gets to make changes? How do you relate to one another? How do you relate them to one another? What's the life cycle management? What happens when something needs to be removed? And we'll talk about that in a minute. This group needs to determine the starting point. So lots of organizations might have something that works for them already, and they want to lift that in and shift it into ServiceNow. That might be a good starting point. There's no way for ServiceNow to kind of tell you that, because you know your own business. But other organizations might say, you know what, we've been looking at it this way for too long. Maybe we need to change something up. Maybe we need to, instead of relying on our org chart, maybe we need to line up to kind of what the board report requires, or some other requirement. You're going to have to approve the rule sets and data models. So that's something we're going to get into, like how do we set these up? What are the control points? Test the configurations, approve changes. So lots of organizations aren't doing a good job of this. If we use the CMDB as an analogy, where you've got you've basically got a hierarchy of records, and then you use change to modify those. We should establish some kind of change process for entities, and we'll take a look at what that might look like. And then we want to establish that execution group. Now, the execution group is going to basically execute the wishes of the oversight committee. So these are going to be the people that manage filters, create entities if you choose to consolidate that activity. And my recommendation here is to keep that execution group relative to your risk and audit and compliance teams. If you consolidate that function out into some central core of administrators, you're gonna lose prioritization. So risk and compliance is critical work, but if you slide this work over to the admins, you're in their queue, and they may have a different prioritization schema. And the other thing is, not every sysadmin or IT person really understands risk and compliance. It's kind of a language of its own, nor do they understand the architecture of IRM. So ServiceNow IRM is architected differently than a lot of the other request fulfill applications that you might be familiar with. So you might have a person with 13 years of ServiceNow experience, but they may not be best suited to manage your IRM solution because they don't know risk, they don't know compliance, and they don't know IRM. We even see this with partners where they've got a long history of implementing ServiceNow, and they think they can just step into IRM, and it tends not to work that way. Okay. Can I just use, I get this one a lot, can I just use my org chart as my entity hierarchy? This is a very common mistake. Do not let your IT department be the one dictating this. I see this happen all the time, where the ServiceNow sysadmin just determines that the department structure, the organizational structure should be the entity structure. They lay that out, and it causes all manner of problems. So just to give you an example of what a hierarchy looks like, this is an example that I came up with for another customer. And so you can see how you can have, first of all, you can have several hierarchies. Okay, you can have a regional roll up for location, and then you can have a business roll up for your organization. But you see how you can collapse, so you can have many entities collapse into one. That's the trick with these entity hierarchies, is that oftentimes that consolidation happens at the risk and compliance part, where they'll see a group of locations and that's all one location to them. So do we need to instantiate those in the entity hierarchy, or can we just create a reference record and use that? These decisions need to be made by your risk and compliance teams. All right, this is where you really need to collaborate with those stakeholders I told you about so that you get this right. The risks to getting this wrong can be drastic. So if we think about that, some of the risks are improper configuration of risks and controls. So now I'm a first line person, I'm a first line person, and I get risks I should have never had, or my aggregation fails. So now, because my relationships were off, my aggregation fails, or my appetite fails. Remember, guys, automation is going to do what you tell it to every time. So we kind of have to automate responsibly here. And what I want to do now is kind of look at some of the features of entities in the application, as well as how to configure some of those. Oop. Sorry.
Awesome. All right.
I gotta learn how to do Power. You want to fire off poll question 2 while I?
Yeah, sure. All right. So we've got another poll, guys. We want to know, how is your entity hierarchy populated today? So if you could just give us a quick answer.
Oh, does this show for everybody, or should I show it here? This polls thing.
You're talking about where the answers coming in?
Correct.
I don't think they can see it until we end the poll, and I'm like,
oh, okay.
Yeah. All right, so some people are fast. We've got some questions in the chat, some good questions. I know we've got a lot of content, so we'll try to get to them. All right, so I think we're good. It looks like we've got folks that most of them are using the manual creation of entity relationships in a hybrid scenario. So I'll share that poll results with everyone.
And that's pretty good. I mean, that's the responsible way of doing it, where you've got a high degree of control when you do that. You're not overscoping. You're not sending people risk assessments they didn't need or notifications they didn't need. So let's walk through how some of this looks in an instance. Okay, so where do we see some of these benefits from the entity structure and the entity hierarchy itself? So what I have here is an entity record, right? This is an entity record in the system. And kind of the first thing you notice is that it gives you an overview of this entire entity. So that entity becomes a collection point for all kinds of activities. You see, I've got risks, I've got controls, I've got audits, I've got tasks assigned to this entity. I've got policy exceptions assigned to this entity. I've got any number of things that I can, that this entity, valuable information that this entity can summarize for me. I can see what it is related to, so that at any point I can understand what the upstream and downstream entities are doing to me from a risk and compliance standpoint. I've got information on the entity, but I also have information on the related records. Okay, so your entity oftentimes can point to an existing record, as I told you before. So one of the ways in which folks get confused is they will create they'll create an entity when they didn't need to. Okay, so if we think of the applies to record here, right? So, this is Acme Midwest. It applies to a company record called Acme. That has attribution of its own. Okay, so it has location information by itself. So this is a case where you might actually not create an entity because you can get to the location information by using a dot walk or by referring to that. Same thing with ownership. So lots of times folks will create a department where maybe they didn't need to, because you always have the department information of the owner. And so is that attribute what you really need to report on? Remember our rules. Am I going to assign a control? Am I going to assign a risk? Am I going to audit? If that location or department is going to be subject to those things, create your entity. If it's not, then maybe you bypass that time. Some other things that we're looking at are the relationships between upstream. Well, actually, let's just do the hierarchy. So the hierarchy is where we're going to be able to see the upstream and downstream relationships. What we can do is either show the directly related ones, or we can show all. So all would be the parents, the grandparents, everything, or the children, the grandchildren, all the way down, or just the related ones. This is where you can actually come in, and this is probably how most of you are adding your relationships. You're doing it here or here.
I got a couple quick questions on this for you. Real quick. All right. So just some basic questions since you're here. So can a child entity have child entities as well?
Correct. It can go all the way up and down. So you're not restricted into the number of levels. I will say that, if you're getting past 6, 7 levels, you're probably going to get into a management conundrum. But yeah, there's no restriction.
All right. And then how do we define the grand entity? Can there only be one?
Nope, you can have 2. So if we come back to this diagram, you're only going to have one top. Okay, so picture this as your global. This is your global. All right. When I say you can have more than one, you can have a regional, you can have a business, or you can have multiple businesses. Like maybe there's one parent, your Alphabet, and then you've got Google and whatever else here. So you're not limited in the number that you can do kind of horizontally here, or I guess vertically in my chart. But it is a good idea to have like one at the top, because usually that one is what you're reporting on at the board level. Usually that's what the board wants to understand.
And then, so how does the risk, and these are basic questions, I see some trending. People are asking about entity types. If you could just quickly show an entity type, because it might be related to another question, which is asking how do you automatically import entities and the relationships from the CMDB? Does it have to be through the workbench?
That's a great segue. So this is an entity type. The entity type is the definition of an entity. So you remember in my SOX example where I was automating identification of the processes, this would be the thing that's doing that. So you define an entity type. That type can have a class. That type can have a tier. Those are just dimensions. Like it's conceptual data. Where we create entities automatically is with entity filters. So entity filters are what define your SOX impacted processes, or your critical services like we're doing here. And so basically it's just a definition of what the thing is. And you need to pay special attention to your entity filters, because fewer narrow ones are like multiple well-defined entities are a little bit more precise than fewer broad entities. You do fewer broad entities, you run that risk of overscoping and hitting people with a bunch of work. Now, that's how I'm establishing what to create an entity of. So for critical business services, these records passed these filters. All right, so now I've created my entity. Of course, I could create an entity by myself. Like if I just wanted to add one, I can always do it manually. But then what we have to do is relate risk statements and control objectives to the entity type. Now we can do this two ways. This is what creates those risks and controls that I showed you earlier. If I attach at the risk framework, then everything in that risk framework is going to create a risk for this entity type. If I attach at the risk statement, I can be a little more granular and say this entity type needs these individual risks instead of this entity type needs this entire framework. And I can do the same thing for policies and objectives. Policies, everything under that policy is going to get created, or I can be precise and relate control objectives here. And so the definition of the entity type with its filter and relationship to statements and control objectives should be a critical management point for your change management process. Like of everything that you need to put under change control, this form I'm showing you and the filter, statement, and control objective, that needs to be tightly regulated.
All right, and then there's questions around risk workbench. Can you also do this through the risk workbench, or is that obsolete?
By risk workbench, I think they're talking about the GRC workbench.
Yeah.
Honestly, guys, I don't use that a ton. That is a kind of a legacy conceptual vestige in my mind. This, that kind of defines how you would relate things. But it's a little hard to manage, and I'd be afraid of losing information. Like I'd be afraid of having too many management points, and I would rather understand the relationships in this screen, looking at the hierarchy of the entities, looking at the relationships to risk statements and control objectives, because that's where the rubber meets the road. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. And the risk workbench isn't necessarily used to create entities anyways, right? It was more for—
it just defines the relationships between the types, not necessarily between the entities themselves. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Drew.
Okay. So we've kind of talked about what entities do. We talked about what they can give us, kind of back to where I was over here. Don't ignore the fact that, you're aggregating risks to entities as well. So, and your entity hierarchy is critical to that risk aggregation. You start messing with those relationships, it'll throw off that aggregation. And now you've misinformed someone of a critical decision. If they were steering by their, by their lost expectancies and making business decisions, you don't want to do that to them, right? So you want to make sure that this is all under control. And so back to kind of how do we control this? What should we do to get a control mechanism in place? That's where I would offer something like compliance case. So risk and it's like the risk, the IRM release next month is gonna have compliance case management. So this is going to be a new feature. It's going to be a case management feature, and it does present itself as an IRM specific ticket, if you will, to capture this unit of work. So you might report a case, you might come up with different types of cases, like, let me create, let me put in a request to create a new one or a modify one or delete one. And we're going to talk about delete specifically in a second here. And then you manage it out through a life cycle, just like you do everything else. That case can have tasks. You can have the individual tasks for that case. You can have approvals. So think about what that might look like. Maybe it's got to go through that advisory board we stood up for an approval. And then the task needs to be created for that execution group to actually go implement the changes. Maybe we want to try this in dev before we start making mass changes in prod. Onesie twosie stuff. Yeah, great. Maybe we can do that. Also think about ACLs. So you ought to have at least 3 groups. You ought to have a stakeholder group, or like the oversight group, a maintenance group, or the execution group, and then the owners. Because you've got entity owners out there who need to do certain things. And so ACLs should be wrapped around those groups. Workflow should be wrapped around those groups. And it's also a good idea to let everybody know what their job is going to be. Right. So, if you're on the oversight, you're going to be doing this. If you're on the execution, you're going to be doing this. If you're an owner, what are the expectations of me now that I'm an entity owner? It's going to be things like, responding to control attestations or delegating those. It's going to be responding to risk assessments or delegating those. It's going to be participating in audits. It's going to be all this kind of stuff. So we kind of talked about who does what. We kind of talked about how to get this under management. I've got a ton more content. I'm going to start cherry picking just because we might run out of time. I want to talk about deletes. Because if we think about the maintenance of the entity hierarchy over time, you're going to add, you're going to modify, you're going to delete. Add, you can create a manual one, or you can use the automation I showed you. Modify, kind of the same thing. You can either do something manually, or you can use Flow Designer to kind of keep things in check. Someone asked a question about how do we reconcile relationships from the CMDB into the entity hierarchy. I propose Flow Designer to do that. I actually propose Flow Designer to do a lot of your data management for you, because you can just set up a for each loop and then, have it loop through the related records and then, create where they're not there or delete if it's not there, kind of however you want to do that. But if you take a look at, so like this is about IRM. The IRM is really the entity client here. But if you look at our BCM product, it takes advantage of those CMDB relationships automatically because of the nature of BCM. But then you get to deletes. Okay, so when you delete an entity, you run the risk of orphaning its children, right? So as you approach deletes, take caution. If you get say you set up that compliance case and you get a delete, I think it's something that you want to take caution with. And I think it's something you want to plan for. Now, understand there is a scheduled job for I think it's called profile cleanup. But there is an out-of-the-box feature that's going to clean up your profiles and entity types when the reference record deletes. So remember, I had an applies to, I had a company entity and it applied to a company record. That company record gets deleted, the system understands to go deactivate that entity. It understands to retire risks and controls related to that entity. So all that downstream stuff. The thing it doesn't do so well, and I'm actually talking to the developers about this right now, I haven't seen where it deletes the relationships. So you've got that M2M table out there that's holding the relationships. I haven't seen where this utility is going to delete that. Now, I'm calling this scheduled job out just because it's supposed to be an advanced class. And so this is me telling you where it's at. But this scheduled job is insufficient to manage your entities, because think about if an entity reaches a retired state, but it doesn't get deleted. What do you want to do then? That's a Flow Designer thing. That's a business decision, first of all. You got to talk to your risk people, because the risk and compliance people may be hesitant to just outright remove it. Because something to be aware of for your risk and compliance customers is that often they need to understand what the risk posture is today, but also what the risk posture was 6 months ago, 6 years ago, whatever that is. ServiceNow is really good at telling you what the risk posture is. Telling you what the risk posture was, we're not so good at. That's where you have to start thinking through things like field like table auditing, or thinking through things like using performance analytics, or thinking through things like actually data warehousing. Because just because you delete something today, if that thing's gone today, it doesn't mean it wasn't present last year and impacting last year's compliance status or risk status. So all of this is to say, when someone wants to take an entity out of service, it's a very good idea to analyze the impacts of it, understand what they're really trying to do. Like, are they trying to wipe it out forever, or is it just taking it out from here forward? Those are important decision points.
Yeah, and then just a point of clarification: we're not suggesting necessarily to delete the entity, more inactivate them, right? So people can't create, maybe a particular data center or server is not active anymore. Mm-hmm. But the risks and controls that the entity may exist as inactive, the risks and controls that were created from that entity will still be available for audit.
The entity, yeah, you're right. I mean, the entity record will be in a deactivated state.
Yeah, and then the related controls, there's that.
But it's still the case that, and again, that's a great feature. I'm glad you said that. It's still that doesn't meet the risk and compliance team's need of understanding of what was 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. It'll just be, this thing ended. And then, don't forget those relationships, because as that entity gets deactivated, and, it's the active button. As it gets deactivated, it's still going to be there, but that's not going to be enough to remove it from your entire process, especially where those relationships are concerned.
Right. And then just so that folks know, when that entity is inactivated, the controls and risks that are related to it become retired.
Correct.
Right. So you're talking about how to manage that post.
Right. Now, the last thing that I want to kind of mention here, well, actually, I think we probably have a poll question at this point, don't we? Yeah. You want to throw up poll question 3?
Sure. All right. So poll question 3 is, what has been your biggest challenge with entities? Is it creating them in the first place, relating them? We do have a question on that. Managing changes to production, retiring them, or the data quality of the reference data. What you're using to create the entities. All right, good stuff. We've got a lot of good questions in the chat, and I don't know if we'll be able to get to all of them, but we'll definitely try to get back to you, or at least try to cover them in office hours next week.
Yeah, so while that poll's getting completed, the last point that I like to make in this is, if you've done this right, think about what you've got. You've got an entity hierarchy. It may or may not be referencing other data and other tables and all this kind of stuff. You might have dependencies on attributes of related records. So your applies to record or your owner record. You've created a data model, right? And I think it's a good idea. You may recall that on my slide of who should be participating in the oversight committee, those data owners, I think they need to understand that, you have a dependency on them. And I also think that you need to maybe think about the maintenance of that data model. So how do you ensure completeness? How do you ensure accuracy of the reference data and the IRM data? And so some things that come up over time, one of them's audit, right? You can audit here to kind of maintain values over time and be sure that things are changing the way that they should. But some other things you could do are
I'm just going to end the poll.
Okay. Good.
So it looks like most people the biggest challenges are around creating them in the first place. So planning and scoping, and then data quality. So does that surprise you?
No, no, that's why I was making the data quality point
Yeah.
use ServiceNow to help you there. Create scheduled reports for data, for data owners that shows gaps.
Mm-hmm.
For completeness, you can put dashboards together. You can do notifications for when fields are blank. There's lots of things you can do there. For accuracy, you can schedule reports for people to review. So you put something in their inbox at the beginning of the quarter or the year or whatever to certify the data. And don't ignore data certification. So ServiceNow data certification on the platform, what it'll do is it'll show the data owner the data as it exists and give them the opportunity to either say, yes, this is correct, or no, I need to change it. So think about entity relationships, like maybe putting the relationships of entities in front of that owner, so that you have some kind of attestation as of 6 months ago that this was still correct. So don't ignore the power of the platform when it comes to maintaining that data model. And then as far as identifying entities to create in the first place, that's a typical issue. So some common places to start looking for entities is, think about previous audits. Think about asset inventories. Think about process inventories. Think about board reporting. Like there's a board report out there somewhere that's getting populated, and it's probably got some entities inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
Think about those spreadsheets that are hanging out there. You've got those risk owners, those control owners. They all have their little spreadsheet of what they're managing. Lots of times there's an answer in the institution, but it just hasn't surfaced because it's nested down in these little stovepipes of information that you kind of have to uncover. Like you have to go digging for them.
Yeah, and we had some slides to try to talk about that, right, Drew? But then we're thinking we need to have a full session because we can't talk about entities without the context of either risk or compliance and the things that you just mentioned. So, maybe that is really just something that we will have a separate session on. Yeah. But if you can throw in the chat in the Q&A, the particular questions or problems that you're having during your planning, that will help us as well put some content together for you.
Do you want to start rifling through the Q&A? Maybe we can get through.
Yeah, we've got a couple things still. Yeah.
I'd rather get to the questions.
You ready? All right.
Yeah, let's answer everybody's questions rather than me talk at them.
All right. See, so they wanted to know actually. So you asked about you answered the red entity, but how do you define it specifically? Is there a place in the tool that you add the grand entity?
To define the entity?
You talked about it before, how you think about it, and how you can to show how they can be related on your Visio chart thingy, but in the actual entity record, how do we relate them up?
Oh, how do we relate them on the entity record? Okay, so that's back here. So remember I showed you the hierarchy. This is an entity record that I'm on now. You come to the hierarchy button, you've got the upstream entity. So these are the parents, you got the downstream, these are the children. I'm just showing the directly related ones. If I click show all upstream, that's going to show me the parents and the grandparents and whatever. And the adding them is just this simple. You click that add button, you find the entity that you want to parent the entity that you're on, the current one, and check the box and add. Or if you need to define a child for Acme Midwest, you do the same thing down here, add it that way. And then your visuals over here. So your hierarchy, kind of at least the downstream, is going to be it's going to be over here for you.
Awesome.
What's the next question?
Folks want to know about the roll-up of the entity. So let's just say the parent entity does not have a risk or control, but it has two child entities that may have risk or controls. Will those compliance scores roll up to the parent?
Right. So, yeah. So if you've got, let me go back to my Miro board here. So let's say that the UK and I, we're not doing controls at the UK and I level. We're not doing risks at the UK and I level. We're doing controls and risks at Ireland and UK. And then we're doing like enterprise stuff up at regional. This node will aggregate everything below it, even though it doesn't have its own risk assessments and controls. And that's what I was saying before, where it's an important distinction, where if you're trying to aggregate loss events all the way up this hierarchy to here, let's say, the aggregation points are entities. Okay, so in your roll up, as you're rolling risks up all this way, each aggregation point is an entity that you can have controls or not, but that's where you put it. Now, contrast that with like operational reporting. Like, I don't need to create a node in my entity hierarchy to report on risks in Ireland or risks in UK. I don't need a node here to report activity, like maybe, loss events in Ireland and loss events in UK. The only thing I need to have a UK and I for is if I want to aggregate residual and inherent loss expectancies at this level, because it's important for somebody making a decision. Super important. Like, you can use the attributes of Ireland and UK to get to a lot of that operational reporting. But where you want to use risk roll up in its formal sense, that's where you would need a UK and I. And what that looks like is back here. So Acme Midwest, all my aggregated risks will show up here.
Awesome. All right. So there's a couple, some really good questions. I'm just kind of picking and choosing ones that we can get through.
Yeah, go for it.
There's just a quick, what is the difference between an entity type and an entity class?
Okay, so an entity type is this guy here. An entity type is going to have entity filters that define what this entity is. The entity type is going to have the relationships to risk statements, so I can create risks, and control objectives, so I can create controls. The entity class is just conceptual information about the entity. It's essentially a tag, and you can set up rules for it and all that kind of business. But when you think of entity classes and you think of entity tiers, those are essentially tags that you can further differentiate entities from one another with. If you start thinking, and we're not talking about compliance today, but on the compliance side, you can do roll-ups of compliance. And on the risk side, you can do roll-ups of risks. But they don't roll up, and you can do roll ups of the entities. Those are my hierarchies. But you're not really going to roll up to classes in a meaningful way, not in the system out of the box today.
Yeah.
So like, I might have a compliance score for a control objective, let's say, or an entity or whatever, and I might be able to roll that up. But the class, it really, think of class as more of a tag than as a meaningful member of the entity hierarchy. It's a reference inside of the entity hierarchy, but it doesn't impact things the way, it's not functional the way this is functional. I got a filter, I got relationships.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so we've got one more poll. Do you want to launch that one? Or
I'd rather do questions. Let's.
All right, awesome.
I mean, if we got questions, let's do that.
We have, if we're not using the GRC workbench, Jan's asking this, where can I go to see the full hierarchy?
The full hierarchy of entities. That's the workbench. So if you need to see a hierarchy of entity types and risks and all that kind of stuff, that's over in the GRC workbench. I just haven't seen where that workbench is entirely useful to, for instance,
the question is if we don't if we don't use the GRC workbench? How else can we see it?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, so at the entities, we can view the entities here at the hierarchy.
You can see it to the right.
If you want, I guess the question I'd ask is, why do you want to see the entity, the relationships between the entity types? Because remember, now we're talking about the relationships between the types. We're not talking about the relationships between the entities.
Yes. Well, I guess
I don't have a good answer for that one. Why don't we move on to the
I
next
think there isn't really a good place right now.
Yeah, it's not a great place.
It's hard. So a lot of folks, what they do is they'll use their Visio and plan it out before they put it into the instance.
Yeah.
Essentially. All right. So we've got 3 minutes left. Let's go through a couple. I wish we had more time, but we do have office hours. And again, if you have specific questions, we can go over again in a follow-up session. Please put those in the chat or in the Q&A. So let's start to wrap it up, Drew. We've got 3 minutes left if you want to go through the key takeaways.
So yeah.
What are your key takeaways for today?
So key takeaways. Number one, the entity hierarchy is fundamental to deriving full value. I have seen companies try to not use it, and it's just you ignore a lot of the automation and a lot of the roll up and everything that the entity hierarchy provides. So test your assumptions and collaborate widely, because it's important to get the value. I mean, you made the investment, you might as well get the value out of the investment you made. Work to your risk and compliance outcomes and then apply the capabilities of ServiceNow to it. Don't start at the capabilities and then work your way back. That's where, and I see it happen all the time, the ServiceNow sysadmin will go, oh, well, I have this entity hierarchy thing I can put together. I have this capability. Let me lay this out in terms of the org chart or some other notion that I have. And it doesn't really meet the outcomes. Again, rely on your oversight committee, but, start at your outcomes and then work to that. And then that governance factor. So, do you have to have the full, the full love circle of everybody involved singing Kumbaya? Maybe not. Everybody's going to have different variations, but at least have some kind of discussion around how you're going to manage these things, and then try to at least maintain visibility, even just for bare audit requirements. Like if you go make this change to the entity hierarchy and it substantially impacts your compliance with something, you're going to want to know who made that change. Auditing surfaces there as a way to track it, but you really want to know that somebody wanted to make the change and why they wanted to make it. So put up the process and put up the committee.
How we want to put governance around the CMDB. You're basically a copy of the CMDB. It's
a good analogy. So like if you think of the entity hierarchy as peer to the CMDB hierarchy and the way CMDB uses change, I'm not saying you have to use change. I'm also not saying go put your entities inside of your CMDB so that you can use change against them. That's not a good idea, because entities don't apply to IT the way they apply to risk. I've seen people try to do that. Use case management, use a catalog item if you have to. But manage it somehow. And you've probably got some experience in data management like that through the CMDB.
Awesome. All right. The last couple of slides again, office hours. Next week, registration is in the Q&A. And then the next one is the last slide, which is just a couple of resources for you to follow up on. We've got the ServiceNow YouTube list. The GRC YouTube list is being revamped. But the content that we're keeping on there is still relevant. We are working on updating it. It just takes a while to update all those videos. But you can see all the GRC community webinars by using that QR code there. And again, this deck will be sent out. So you'll have it, and see you guys in office hours next week.
Thanks, guys. Y'all bring you questions next week.
Awesome.